This is the last session of this afternoon. This will be a 30-minute talk. The speaker would prefer if you have questions that you talk to her after the talk rather than doing a standard QA. So our speaker is Julie Pagano. When I asked her how to introduce her, she said just to say Julie's going to talk about imposter syndrome. So without further ado, she's going to be talking about It's Dangerous to Go Alone, Battling the Invisible Monsters in Tech.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So hi, I'm Julie Pagano, and I'm here today to give you a talk entitled It's Dangerous to Go Alone, Battling the Invisible Monsters in Tech. So I'm here to talk to you today because I love to code. And most of you are probably at PyCon because you also love to code. You're here because you want to learn more. You want to improve, be the best coder that you can be. So we start doing things like testing, design patterns, software craftsmanship, tools, and more. But we're missing something. It's hard to focus on your love of coding when you're regularly battling invisible issues like insecurity, anxiety, and lack of confidence. These issues create hurdles to success, both for individuals and also for the community as a whole, because what we do is incredibly communal. Most of us use open source, which means we're using code that was written by other people, and we do pull requests and file issues and bug reports on that open source. We do code reviews when we write new code. We pair program. We go to user groups. We're at a conference right now. We talk a mailing list and IRC. What we do is exceptionally communal. And so when individuals in our community are held back by these hurdles, the community as a whole is held back. And I think we need to talk about this because ignoring it makes it worse. It turns it into the adult version of the monsters under the bed. It's scary and isolating because those around you don't understand or actively deny what you're going through. So today, I'm going to talk to you about one of the major issues that impacts people, and then I'm going to give you some tools to fight back and to help others do so as well. So let's start out with our issues. The issue I want to focus on today is something called impostor syndrome. Impostor syndrome is a psychological phenomenon in which people are unable to internalize their accomplishments. I want you to think for a second about what that means for a programmer. Coding involves regular failure. I fail on a weekly, if not a daily basis. I break things, I introduce bugs, I hit problems that are difficult for me to solve. And I think that's probably the case for most people. Who in the room fails pretty regularly, right? So the average person, they're able to balance out that failure with their successes. I fixed something today. I solved a really hard problem. I introduced a new feature that made my users really happy. And so most people are able to create this kind of equilibrium. For people with imposter syndrome, it looks a little different. They tend to focus really heavily on their failures. They feel much larger, and their successes feel much smaller. And so they get this imbalance. Bless you. One of the people I interviewed to prepare for this talk described it thusly: victories diminish in importance, failures loom large. This is what it feels like to have imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome can impact anyone. I interviewed people to prepare for this talk, and they cross-cut almost all boundaries. There were people who had been programming for 20 years, people who had just started programming, people with a traditional computer science degree, people who had taught themselves. There were men, there were women, young, old, all sorts of different demographics. Every demographic is impacted by imposter syndrome. It's not just one group. And everybody in the audience probably knows at least one person that has imposter syndrome. And I bet that there's at least a few people in the audience or in this room that have imposter syndrome. There's at least one. I have imposter syndrome. And I see some other people raising their hands. And there's some things you often will hear from people with imposter syndrome that helps you identify that they have it. And you'll often hear these things when you give them praise, tell them they did a good job. You'll hear things like, I was just lucky. Or, I'm not that smart. Or even, I'm not a good programmer. And the thing that they often think to themselves but don't say out loud, I'm a fraud. This is kind of the core of imposter syndrome. It's where the name comes from. People who suffer from this issue not only think poorly of themselves, but they think they're a fake. And they're terrified that the people around them are eventually going to find out. Now, you may be saying to yourself, but Julie, everybody gets insecure some of the time. What's the big deal? Why have you given a name to this? And I want to be clear. The average person does have ups and downs with insecurity throughout their career. That's pretty normal. A common time when you'll have an up on that is when you start a new job. You're new, everybody else seems to know so much more than you, and you feel insecure. But it normally evens out. For people with impostor syndrome, they also have those ups and downs, but it tends to be much more heightened, it tends to have much greater impact for them, and it tends to be a more systemic problem with long-lasting consequences. So one of those consequences is that people with impostor syndrome often hold themselves back. For example, they often don't share knowledge. Things like speaking at a conference, writing a blog post, even just talking to people at work. Because either they don't think that they have anything valuable to share, or they're afraid that if they speak out loud, that somebody might hear them say something stupid and find out what a fraud they are. They often don't collaborate. A good example of this is pair programming. If you don't think you're as good as your peers, and you're afraid of people finding out, imagine how terrifying pair programming is, having somebody watch you write code all day. It's really scary. Some people with imposter syndrome will actually avoid pair programming entirely because they're so afraid of that. Or they will perform more poorly because it makes them so anxious. Another thing, and this is pretty important for Python, is they don't help with open source. A lot of them either don't think that they're qualified because they devalue their own skill sets, or they're afraid of doing something so public, right? If you do a pull request on GitHub, everybody sees that, and that could be very scary if you're afraid of people finding out you're a fraud. Lastly, a lot of them don't apply for jobs. And I've seen this with some friends and some of the people I interviewed, that they were stuck at dead-end jobs, whether they were being underpaid or they weren't developing as programmers anymore, and they were reaching burnout, and they weren't even trying to find new jobs, even though there's plenty of programming jobs available because they didn't think they were good enough. And this one hits really close to home for me. So I'm a software engineer at Google. I've been there for about a year now. And I've been out of school for about 6 or 7 years. And I've been wanting to work at Google since I went to school for computer engineering. I never applied for an internship there because I didn't think I was good enough. When I graduated, I didn't even send them my resume, didn't try to get a job there because I didn't think I could get a job there. I thought I was too stupid, I wasn't smart enough. So I got a job somewhere else, and I became unhappy there a few years in, and I was just like those other people. I didn't apply for another job because I didn't think I could go anywhere else. And eventually, a recruiter from Google contacted me, and she spent like a good 30 minutes on the phone with me, talking me down from my imposter syndrome, convincing me that I should interview, that it was worthwhile for them and for me. And from there, I studied. I went through a hard interview. I got a job. I work there now. It's great. But if a recruiter had talked to me sooner, or if I didn't have imposter syndrome, maybe I would have been working at Google for 5 years. And if a recruiter had never contacted me, maybe I would have never worked there. So that can be one of the scary impacts of having this issue. One of the people I interviewed described it thusly: you shouldn't feel like you have to slay a dragon to get a job. And for everybody, applying for a new job is really scary, but for people with imposter syndrome, it reaches heights of mythical proportions. And that can make it very scary for them. Another person I interviewed described imposter syndrome thusly: you start small, like everybody does. We all start small. But you remain small because of the innumerable ways that you hold yourself back. And as a result, you end up small. You never reach your full potential because you're so afraid, you're holding yourself back, you don't think you're worthwhile. And this is what imposter syndrome can end up doing when people don't help with it. So another thing you may be saying to yourself is, Julie, these people think they're bad programmers. Maybe they're just bad programmers. And I want to be clear, those are not the people I'm talking about. A reasonable number of people are kind of on this chart where like their perception of their ability and their actual ability, they're roughly aligned. They're not perfect, but they're close enough. If they were bad programmers and they knew it, they'd be on this line. I'm not talking about those people. People with imposter syndrome kind of live over here. They're actually pretty good programmers. They just don't think they are. They have a poor internal barometer of what their actual skill sets are. What's interesting is there's another group of people that also have a really poor understanding of their skill set. And those people have something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias in which unskilled individuals suffer from illusory superiority, mistakenly rating their ability much higher than average. And those folks live over here. And so they think they're really great, and their skills are actually pretty low. And what I think is really interesting is that both of these groups of people live and work in the software industry. And it's interesting to think about what the impact is of those two different groups. Folks with Dunning-Kruger tend to not know what their boundaries are. They think they're hot shit. And like as a result, they think they can do anything. They don't understand where the limitations of their knowledge are. They often don't realize when they should ask for help, when they need to learn more. But they're putting themselves out there. They're applying to speak at conferences. They're writing blog posts. They're applying for jobs because they think they're really great. On the reverse side, the folks with imposter syndrome, they're actually very qualified and they know what their limitations are, which can be really important in software. You want to know, this is my area of knowledge, this is where I need help, this is where I'm not sure and I need to talk to another expert. On the downside, people with imposter syndrome, they're not applying for jobs, they're not speaking at conferences, they're not contributing to open source. And so I don't have any specific conclusions here, but I think this is useful to think about in reference to, should we help people with imposter syndrome? So I talked about people who hold themselves back. Some people go on the other side. They push themselves too hard. Because they perceive themselves to be not as qualified as they really are, they often think they're falling behind their peers. And as a result, they try to play catch up. They will start trying to take on extra projects, read more books, do this, do that, go to all the user groups, do all the things. And they're doing all the things. All the things. And this is not sustainable for any period of time. I know, I've tried. It's really bad. And when you try to do this for really any sustained period of time, you hit something called burnout. And burnout is a long-term exhaustion and diminished interest in work. And when you get to burnout, you don't love coding anymore. In fact, most of the time you kind of hate it. A lot of people, when they get to burnout, they don't love coding and they're usually doing the bare minimum. They're like doing just enough not to get fired because they hate everything and they're exhausted and they don't want to do anything anymore. And this is kind of game over. A lot of people, when they hit this point of burnout, have a difficulty coming back. I've seen this happen to people where they left for a few months or a few years. Some of them left permanently. And this one hits a little close to home for me. About a year and a half ago, I hit burnout really bad. I had been trying to do all the things for about a year. And let me tell you, a year is too long to do all the things. It's way too long. I have friends in the audience and they're laughing, they know. And so when that happened, I would say it lasted about a month for me. And I had a really good support system and I was able to really get back on the horse and like it was okay. But I've seen this happen to friends where they were gone for 6 months or a year or many years and some of them just quit. And so this is really what we want to avoid. This is why I'm talking to you today. This is not something that has to happen, but we have to work on imposter syndrome. If you just leave it go, it tends to end with game over. And since I've depressed you with all that, now we're going to talk about ways that we can actually help, because you totally can. It's not a foregone conclusion that you hit burnout. But it is dangerous to go alone. You have to do something. Leaving imposter syndrome alone tends to end real bad. So I'm going to give you some advice both from myself and from the people I interviewed. Please keep in mind that your mileage may vary for some of these. You're all different human beings, but I recommend trying things and seeing what works best for you. So my biggest piece of advice, and this is advice that I think everyone needs, is you should build a party. And what I mean by this is a support system of people that are going to help you throughout dealing with your imposter syndrome. These should be people that you know, that you trust, that care about you. Ideally, you care about them. They could be coworkers that you trust. They could be friends that are programmers. They could be your boss if you have a good relationship with them. But these are people who are going to give you good feedback about different things, and they're going to give you constructive feedback. They're not going to be yes people. They're not going to say, you're awesome, and like be shaking their heads all the time. If you do something wrong, they're going to tell you, but they're going to be constructive about it. And the reason that you want this is for two reasons. One, if you have imposter syndrome, your internal measure of your own skill set is a little bit broken, and you need to look at outside people who can give you an honest answer. Am I doing a good job as a programmer? Where do I need to improve? And they're going to try to give you feedback that you're going to listen to. The other thing is, you're going to have bad days. And you want people who can support you when you have bad days. You don't want to try to go the entire thing alone. So this is really critical. And this has been incredibly helpful for me in fighting imposter syndrome. Another thing you want to do is track measurable progress. We're all software engineers, or most of us. We like data, right? So this is really useful because if you ask somebody a subjective question and they have imposter syndrome, are you a good programmer? A lot of times they say, no, I'm a bad programmer. So you want to start to have some data you can look at so that you can have a more objective viewpoint of where you're improving on things. So you can set some practical goals. Don't set goals that you know you can't meet. That's setting yourself up for failure. But you're going to set some practical goals. They could be, I'm going to go through this many books of this on this language, this many chapters. It could be, I'm going to fix this many bugs. Or I'm going to go to a user group for the first time because I've been afraid of doing that. One of mine last year was, I will speak at one conference. Doesn't matter how big or how small, I will speak at one. And I spoke at 3 last year, so I consider that a success. That was an improvement, and so when people ask, are you a good speaker? If I'm asked a subjective question, I tend to say no. If I try to look at my objective data, I can say, well, I spoke at 3 conferences last year. And so it can help you to try to find positive things when you want to say something negative. And this brings me to my next point. Start training yourself to look for positives. For a lot of people who don't have imposter syndrome, this is just part of their life. They know to look for positives and negatives. They have that balance I showed earlier. For you, you have to train yourself. And so one of the ways you can do this is with tracking measurable progress. Another is just forcing yourself to do it. Start small, say once a month, I'm going to actively look for something positive that I can say about what I did as an engineer. Maybe it's something really small. Maybe it's, I fixed a bug. I went to a user group. You can start small, that's okay. And then you're gonna go to maybe once a week, and then once a day. And then maybe you're gonna try to make yourself dig a little deeper for that. And what ends up happening is what you have made a chore eventually becomes a habit. And eventually you can start to train yourself to look for positives because you know you have to do it. And you can start to create a little bit more balance. You have to train yourself to do something that comes naturally to everybody else. On the reverse side, for those of you in the room who maybe don't have imposter syndrome and you want to help others, and really this is good advice for everybody, help people look for positives. A lot of times we only like to point out when people screw things up, oh, this code isn't good enough. How did you not know how to do this? What's wrong with you? Also think about cases where somebody helped. This was really great code that you just wrote. That bug you fixed helped me. Try to give people positive feedback, and when you give negative feedback, be constructive about it. On the reverse side, as somebody with imposter syndrome, you want to avoid negatives. We all know that person. The hostile geniuses that seem to exist at every user group, workplace, wherever, some really smart person, but who's kind of nasty to everybody around them and tends to just find negatives, like they zero in on it. You did this wrong, you did that wrong, I know more than you. Those people tend to exist everywhere. They're like kryptonite for people with imposter syndrome. If you can, try to avoid them. Realistically, that's not always possible. And so the one thing you can do is identify that that's the kind of person it is and recognize that they are an invalid source of data about you. They're not useful. You have a party, and those are people who you know and trust to tell you when you do things wrong and also to tell you when you do things right. Their data is useful. People like this, as best you can, try to remember that they're not useful. On the reverse side, try to avoid creating negative spaces for others. And these are less obviously hostile things, but they're things that a lot of us commonly do. Hacker School's user manual actually has a list of 4 things that I really like that I think people should avoid. And they are no feigning surprise. Oh my God, you don't know that thing? Let's face it. In the wide world of software engineering, none of us know everything. Don't be a jerk when other people don't know stuff. Likewise, no well actuallys. Well, actually, there's a slightly different thing from what you said, and it's not important, but I just have to tell you how wrong you are. Don't do that. No backseat driving. It's just as annoying when you do it when people are coding as when people are driving. Don't do it. And lastly, no subtle sexism, racism, homophobia, etc. That one hopefully is a foregone conclusion. But the first 3, I think, are things that a lot of us do, myself included, that we don't mean to. Some of it's cultural, and some of it is we just don't realize what impact it can have on people. And you have to really work on this. I've been working on well actuallying. I totally do it to people. I'm trying to stop. But we don't get value from any of those things. We really don't. But decreasing these things, minimizing how much they happen in our workspaces, our communities, can actually create a world where people with imposter syndrome have a better time at thriving. Because all of these activities, they bring them down. There are little things that encourage them to believe that what they said is wrong, that they're frauds, that they're imposters, and there's not much value from doing these things. So really be mindful of when you do them and try to stop. Another thing that's really useful is helping others. This was really critical for me in dealing with my imposter syndrome. I run the Girl Develop It chapter in Pittsburgh, and I teach classes for them. And this was so helpful for me because I started to find so many positives when I was helping people. I had students who were so excited that I was teaching them and helping them, and I was able to remind myself, I have value. Even if I'm not the world's best software engineer, look at all these positive things that I'm doing and how excited these students are. Another thing this helped me see is what imposter syndrome looks like from the other side. I had students in my classes who were doing a great job, like intro to HTML and CSS classes have never programmed before in their lives. And the students are picking stuff up really fast. And they look at me very seriously and say, I'm so bad at this. I'm stupid. I can't do this. And they meant it. And I broke my heart. And I realized, oh God, this is what I sound like to other people. And so I'm much more mindful of it now because I don't want to break other people's hearts. I don't want to do that to people. And on the reverse side, I have to be really careful about being self-deprecating like that when I'm put in a position of authority over other people, when I'm a teacher, when I'm a mentor. They look up to me. And if I say I'm stupid or I'm a bad programmer, what does that mean I think about them? And I would never want to make my students think that I think they're stupid. So I have to be very careful. And in the nature of trying not to be self-deprecating because it would hurt my students, I just have diminished doing it, period, because I have to be more mindful of it. So it's been really helpful in that way. Now, my slightly controversial piece of advice, kill your heroes. Not literally. Please don't chase the other speakers around with a sword later. It violates the code of conduct. No, what I mean by this is that in the software industry, and some communities do this more than others, we hold certain members of our community up as like these godlike celebrity heroes. And we start to imagine that they were like birthed fully formed with a laptop writing amazing code. And we don't believe that they make mistakes. We just think they're magical. And for somebody with imposter syndrome, that can be really damaging because you don't ever, if you look at people like that, you can't believe you can be as good as them because they never make mistakes. And they just magically have always been writing code this great. And so you never see a path from where you are to where they are. So what I really recommend doing, kill the hero, leave behind the human being that's actually there. And that allows you to see, oh, they write bad code. They make mistakes. Like, I don't know the celebrities in this community as well. I originally come from the Ruby community. I've seen some of the Ruby heroes. They write bad code, just like everybody else does. And it's important to see that they are human beings. And that also they started small, just like everybody else does. Nobody was birthed with a laptop writing amazing code. And if they did, I feel really sorry for their mother because I don't know how that would happen. But like it would just be a bad time. And so nobody does that. People learn, people progress, people make mistakes, they learn from their failures. And so it's really important to keep that in mind because then you can see, oh, they make mistakes like me. They're a human being too. And if I work hard, I could become awesome too. And also thinking about the fact that you don't have to be them to be awesome. There are many paths to awesomeness. You don't have to be like one of the celebrities. And I have my own little story about this, about somebody from the Ruby community named Aaron Patterson. This is totally his Twitter picture. I didn't make a silly picture. He's also known as Tenderlove. And he is totally one of those ridiculous celebrity heroes. And I'll tell you how much I know this, because like people in the Ruby community know about his cat, Gorby Puff. Why do they know the name of this guy's cat? And they also, it's so ridiculous, they have stickers with pictures of his cat on their laptops. I'm not even kidding. So he talks a lot in the Ruby community, and he's a really great speaker. He's legitimately one of my favorite speakers in the Ruby community, and I did ask his permission to put his face on here. I didn't like do it behind his back. And I really enjoy his talks. And a few years ago, when I was starting to think about doing public speaking, I thought, I can't do this. I'm terrified of public speaking. Fun fact, still terrified of public speaking. I'm just faking it right now. But so I was very afraid, and so I didn't think I could do it because he looks so natural. He's such a great speaker. How could I ever be that awesome? He's clearly been doing it like this forever. And then I saw him speak at Steel City Ruby a few years ago, and before he spoke, he said, I get insanely nervous when I give presentations. And he went on to give an amazing presentation. It was really great. But he said this before his talk. And by saying those words, it killed the hero and left behind a human being. And I was able to say, well, clearly this doesn't preclude me from being a speaker, because Aaron gets nervous too, and he's one of my favorite speakers. So I may not be as great as him when I start, but this isn't an excuse not to try. And maybe one day if I speak as long as he has, I'll be a great speaker too. And so that was really helpful to me. And so I pushed myself and I started speaking. And now I'm here at PyCon speaking. And thank you. And so the last piece of advice I want to give that I heard from actually every single person that I interviewed was some variant of this: fake it till you make it. And I want to be clear, do not use this for your technical skills. Do not put stuff on your resume that's a lie. Ends badly for everyone. But this is really, really great for areas where you don't have quite enough self-confidence. Things like public speaking. I'm not sure if I can be a speaker, but maybe I'll just pretend I can and we'll see how it goes. Things like that. Or I'm not sure if I can get this job, but I'm gonna try, and if it ends horribly, well, I tried. Sometimes just pushing yourself a little bit in those areas where you're not sure. It can help you push yourself past your imposter syndrome, especially if you have the support of a party to help you with it. One of the people I interviewed put it like this: the secret to life is pretending you know what you're doing. This is a picture of my cat. So I want to leave you with, I really want you to start talking about imposter syndrome. For a lot of people that I've heard talking to about this, just knowing that there's a name for the thing that they're dealing with is incredibly helpful, knowing they're not alone. So please talk about this. Please get help if you suffer from this issue. It does get better. I swear, I've tried. And trying some of these things, it's an incremental process, but it does get better. And please help others. Like I said, this is a communal problem. Just because you don't suffer from imposter syndrome doesn't mean you aren't impacted by people being held back by it. So please, make the effort to help people if you see them being suffering from these issues. And please enjoy coding. I love it, and I want you to as well. And I wanted to let you know that I started creating an online support group on Google Groups for people who want to chat about imposter syndrome in the tech industry. And these are on my slides. I'll tweet them later if you don't want to write this down. But you're welcome to join us there if you want to. We've been doing Google Hangouts, hanging out in an IRC chat room, and then there's also the Google group. And my slides will be up on the speaker deck. And I always love getting feedback about my talk because this is a really important issue, and I want to know how I can improve it, or if you have feedback, so please share. And I have some references in the slides after if you want them when you download them. And I think that's it. I will happily talk to people like in a group down here or in the hall when we run out of time. I'm just not a big fan of Q&A for this talk because this is a pretty private issue for a lot of people, and they don't want me to repeat their questions in front of a room of 150 people. So I will chat with all of you, but not Q&A. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.